right, ladies and gentlemen, please enter. Last guests, find a seat. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Yuri Mason. I'm Associate Director of Education and Public Affairs here at Witte de With, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of Witte de With and Kunstblock, our partners here in the Witte de With City Quarter, 10 CBK, Mama, Worm and V2, to our first keynote evening of the Futurosity Summit. Time, in our time, can be characterized by two elementary principles. One is that the future is always different from the present. And two, time seems to be always speeding up. Or in the words of Douglas, acceleration is accelerating. This way of experiencing time might seem self-evident. However, it is far from set in stone. Pre-modern thinking, as formulated by Augustine, for example, sees time much more as a linear experience. Or Buddhist and Hindu thinking sees time much more as a cyclical one. The rift between past, present and future has been a definitive modernist invention, radically shifting the balance between experience on one hand and expectation on the other. With it came the idea of progress, an invention first celebrated and then condemned. The idea that nothing is permanent saw experience and expectation pitched into the unknown. History was past and the future was unpredictable. Let us ask, we thought, how relevant actually the notion of future is in a time when nothing seems more certain than change. While at the same time every prediction, every science fiction we encounter nowadays seems to present a fixed endgame scenario. Who owns the future nowadays? Who does it belong to? Or is the future an outdated concept at all, which is in dire need of some revision? Today and tomorrow's summit forms the highlight of a year-long project of Kunstblock called Futurosity, developed in collaboration with Douglas Copeland, and the booklet you've all received, this one, gives you an overview of that project. It included exhibitions, publications, art in public space, and much, much more. The summit program today and tomorrow includes lectures and workshops. Please have a look. There's much more to come. I'd especially like to thank the partners in our project. The first being Rotterdam viert de stad, Rotterdam celebrates the city. For this year marks the 75th anniversary of the reconstruction of the city's heart after its destruction in World War II. Futurosity, our program, contributes to the public debate in this regard around the mentality of our city. Rotterdam, a city which, in contrast to many other cities, doesn't look to the past, we hold, to shape its identity, but rather to the future. And I'd like to thank a second partner in this project, the Art of Impact, together with whom we investigate the question of future also beyond the city, both on a societal scale and on a more personal one. During this summit, we ask which kinds of contingencies can be part of a vocabulary, be it artistic, fictional or otherwise, to re-empower the notion of future in the 21st century. Today, we'll have a presentation by Willem Schinkel, and after a keynote conversation by Douglas Copeland and Shumon Bashar. First, it's my honor to present to you Willem Schinkel, who is a professor of social theory at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He is a member of the Young Academy of the Royal Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences and specializes in the fields of social theory, political philosophy and sociology of art. Now, together with a host of thinkers, he is setting up a Center for the Public Imagination, which will launch on June 17th at the International Architecture Biennial here in Rotterdam. Please be invited and welcome there as well. Tonight he will speak on the future, and especially on what the future will look like in relation to the way we currently imagine smartness. So to start the evening, I'd like to have a big hand for one of the brightest thinkers in Rotterdam at the moment, Mr. Willem Schinkel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all? Thanks for the invitation to speak here at this very interesting summit I'd never spoken at a summit before, so especially honored in that respect. What I want to do today is to explore a bit the relationship between what I will call smart charisma, which is a social imagination surrounding so-called smart technologies, and the mobilization of futurity. And I will make some connections between, for instance, smart technologies and financial speculation, and I'll highlight some of the key elements of smart technologies and their implementation that mobilize in one way or another futurity. And I do so mainly with an interest in the politics of smartness. Now, I have to say right up, when I talk about futurity, I mean to bear in mind the fact that the future doesn't exist, which to me is a very obvious statement, but it needs some explaining sometimes. The future doesn't exist, or rather that past and future are always simultaneous effects of distinguishing between the non-simultaneous. But future is always simultaneous to the past in that sense. And because the future doesn't exist, futurity is very much a matter of the imagination, which takes place in techniques such as the simulation, the experiment, the model, the scenario, and in various forms of speculation. And especially in speculation, it then becomes clear that futurity is closely tied to capital. So an imagination of a smart future is therefore speculative in more than one sense. Now I want to start off with some of the more recent versions of what has been called the Californian ideology, which you can also call the Silicon Valley ideology or a Silicon Valley ideology. And I want to review some of the currently more salient elements of a Silicon Valley imagination that is, I think, not without effects in the much more local, banal ways in which smart city technologies are connected to a certain version of the future, or to futures, and thus to futurity in a more abstract sense. This is taken from Balaji Srinivasan's 2013 lecture called Silicon Valley's Ultimate Exit. And I take it here as a kind of symptom that introduces a particular mode of imagining the future. Srinivasan discusses several ways of escaping by means of technology from what he considers the paper belt. All right? So he discusses several ways of escaping by means of technology. I even might do without if you want. So, by means of technology, from what he considers the paper belt, and that means basically politics. The paper belt, according to him, is hostile to Silicon Valley and will try to prevent it from leaving, but technology will come to the rescue of the oppressed Californians. So he speaks of the paper belt in analogy to the Rust Belt, right? And the paper belt is all this old bureaucratic thinking in terms of literally paper, and he considers that an outdated model. Some of his colleagues in being immersed in this ideology sometimes speak of law and politics as ancient but now obsolete algorithms. So at the same time, this escape, which is in a sense literally what Lewis Mumford called utopias of escape, entails certain desires to govern. Srinivasan, for instance, recalls Google's Larry Page's suggestion to set aside a part of the world for unlimited experimentation. And I think that such ideas of escape and experimentation on the world are enveloped very much in corporate settings, but this, according to Srinivasan and many others, is not a problem since governments start wars, not companies, he says. So companies can start new countries, or new countries can be modeled on the corporation, which is presumably the tech corporation. And one example of this, which he also mentions, is Delta Sync octopus city, which is devised by the Seasteading Institute, which also, for instance, operates an abandoned oil rig outside territorial waters as a kind of libertarian haven, albeit a haven in the midst of the ocean. It is funded by PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel and run by neoliberal economist Milton Friedman's grandson. And the idea is that one can freely carry a concealed weapon on an abandoned oil rig. And this is a freedom, typically, as for most neoliberals, that is purely negatively defined. Now, this kind of fantasy also has colonial connotations of the frontier spirit, which, and I'll come back to that connection later, was also associated with the rise of financial speculation in the early 20th century. But there are various forerunners of such ideas in the 20th century, and one example is the fantasies of space colonization, as recently recounted by Douglas Murphy and Felicity Scott. And these drew also on an explicit anti-government rhetoric and a humanitarian vision in which corporate solutions would solve problems such as poverty without war. And I think these things are very timely now with Elon Musk's plans for a Mars colony. But at the same time, I think something is different. And this is why I think this kind of stuff is important. Rather than enjoying the symptoms of past utopian fantasies, we should look for the ways in which current versions of such fantasies have real impacts on contemporary modes of governing life. I think it's very telling that many of today's techno-utopian plans are actually returning to Earth instead of escaping from Earth. Most are actually returning to Earth. And in the Anthropocene, you might say the planet itself is recognized. So, characteristic of this is the central role played by emergencies. Emergencies are increasingly considered in planetary terms. So the neoliberal fantasy of the Seasteading Institute, for instance, is one example, and Larry Page's seemingly modest proposal to set aside a part of the world for unlimited experimentation is another. And what such conceptions have in common is a conception of the future in terms of experimentation. The future is seen in terms of experiment, laboratory, scenario, simulation, demo, prototype, test, pilot, version, exploration, or trial. These are the dominant concepts of today. And I want to say that if today's techno-gurus are rehearsing for various utopias of escape, we should on the one hand let them roast in their Star Trek fetish, but on the other hand, we should take seriously the elements in their accounts that are also operative beyond the confines of Silicon Valley. And this is where I think it is pertinent to talk of a certain smart charisma. Silicon Valley is home to a mix of extreme libertarianism, a particular kind of techno-utopianism, and a corporate neoliberalism. And combined, these constitute a smart charisma that is present in many instances way beyond Silicon Valley. Smart charisma is what I would call an atmosphere of futurity. It involves a constant claim to the future. And this claim is indeed atmospheric. It is both a mood or a mentality, and it is realized by means of cloud computing. So the Californian ideology, the Silicon Valley ideology, is in a sense really an ideology of an ideology. It takes attention away from the actually existing and often consequential smart charisma that is perhaps understood best as a derivative ideology. The Silicon Valley ideology, such as voiced by Srinivasan, is really a marketing image that's way too easy a target, and I think it's not really what is operative in conjunction with the actual implementation of smart technologies around the world. So it's perhaps even too easy to speak of a techno-utopianism, and I doubt if it's even justified to speak of utopianism here. I rather think these Silicon Valley fantasies constitute simulations of utopia that lend charisma, an atmosphere of being advanced and of futurity to everyday, banal, implementations of sensors on streets here as well, and in homes and in or on bodies. So if we are interested in what smart technologies do with futurity, we should focus on smart charisma in both its imaginaries and its materialities. Now, smart charisma is suffused with exit strategies, but these are not the actual exits from a supposed paper belt or from government. I think that rather at the everyday scale, they are exits from politics towards a management of optimization amidst parameters that tend to be placed beyond the realm of political antagonism or even deliberation. So in terms of exit, we are mostly dealing with technologically mediated forms of depoliticization and of selective disarticulations of the social. And now one forerunner of both the quasi-utopian design fantasies and of a libertarian anti-political attitude is, of course, Buckminster Fuller, who is revered today both by Silicon Valley adepts and by designers of a less reflexive sort. Buckminster, for instance, said that we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. And he also said that humankind was an experiment of nature. And I think this is really illustrative of the connection between futurity and emergency. The idea is that claims on the future are necessary because otherwise we will perish. And I'm not disputing this directly, but nor am I confirming it. But I want to look at the shape that the 1970s lust for experimentation, for regarding the world as a model, a temporary version, a trial, takes today in the imagination of smart cities. And most famous are cases where entire cities are built as prototypes, such as Songdo in South Korea, built by Cisco Systems, and by a real estate company, development company from Boston called Gale. Another example is Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, where Siemens plays a main role, also in providing venture capital alongside, for instance, Credit Suisse. Now, cities such as Songdo and Masdar are prototypes. They are live brochures for smart technologies. Songdo is actually a huge cost and does not really deliver the investment returns perhaps hoped for, but I think it can be seen, first of all, as part of a logic of financial speculation that is divorced from actual returns. And secondly, it can be seen as a marketing device. As marketing devices, such cities are actually existing utopias that, just as the utopias of escape, provide the credibility and aura that I would call smart charisma. But of course, actually existing utopia is a paradox precisely because it removes the paradox from utopia, the paradox of a place that is not. When places that are non-existent start to exist after all, we are no longer dealing with the utopian imagination. And Keller Easterling has recently argued how such cities operate through the principle of the zone, which involves a form of infrastructure space, she says, that constitutes an increasing normalization of a form of power that she calls extra statecraft, which is something Aiwa Ong has also previously analyzed as a governing through exception. That is an intricate part of neoliberalism. And these are important observations, but as with the Silicon Valley fantasies of escape, I want to switch scales now and see what smart charisma means when the smart city is considered not as a prototype, not those fantastic projects such as Masdar and Songdo, but as a bundle of prototypes and pilots, so as what some scholars have called the actually existing smart city. The exit from politics that smart charisma enables takes the form of permanent trials and experiments and prototypes. And in what historian Orit Halpern has, in a fascinating study called testbed urbanism, the city becomes a living lab, as, for instance, explicitly conceptualized at MIT, which you see here. The idea of the city as a lab is actually quite old. One might regard Plato's ideal state as having features of a laboratory. But the imaginary in space of a laboratory is quite modern, of course. Yet over a century ago, in 1913, George Ford said in a piece called The City Scientific that in the science of city planning, the whole city is our laboratory. So here too, it's important to note that there are many precursors to what happens today. Testbed urbanism is not really a recent thing. And it's important to see that in order to see also where smart charisma's contemporary singular effects are to be located. Walt Disney, for instance, was a champion in this kind of experimentation. His so-called experimental prototype community of tomorrow was meant to be a living experiment in which citizens could, according to the Disney Family Museum, I've not been there, but I'm quoting it, citizens could enjoy the latest technologies produced by American corporations. This was the idea. And it was in the end not built, but Disney's community of celebration was, and so were, amongst others, Minnesota Experimental City and the French prototype city Le Vaudreuil. Now, something particular happens to time when the city is a geography of constant testing and experimenting. As Orit Halpern has said, the city becomes a dehistoricized terrain. One could also say that it becomes obsessed with futurity and that its present is a constant protension, a constant grasping toward the future. Futurity is constantly mobilized as the revision of the present. And hence the present is constantly conceived as a flexible site for further experimentation. The results of experiments will give rise to future experiments, and hence the main elements of the smart city are its efficiency and the optimization of its flows, and optimization, of course, never ends. So the present then is merely one system state, one moment in a processual web of flows, and it is coded as permanently open to innovation, ever flexible, and without political elements such as decisions, ideological convictions, antagonisms, or whatever algorithms of the past. And this future then is forever flexible, and thereby it is also the eternal return of the present. Because the ultimate parameters, ultimately highly neoliberal, of future flexibility never change. Change is the only constancy, but this pertains to a particular kind of change, to change within the city conceived as a depoliticized bundle of flows that are immersed in an ever-repeating process of optimization. So, as you may sense, this is where I'm getting somewhat critical, but let's first look at the pervasiveness, really, of the laboratorial logic in smart cities. These are just some examples of how pervasive the living lab imagination is today. Today, it does not concern modernist plans for entire cities. So Songdo and Masdar City are prototypes, but I think the true political import of experimentation lies at a more banal level of small-scale actual implementation of smart technologies. And these are just some examples of how local initiatives are imagined in terms of experimentation and the laboratory. And the Citizen thing is from Amsterdam Smart City. But just yesterday, when I was visiting the Urban Transition Conference here in Rotterdam, I heard the planner and project manager of Rotterdam Digital City say that his efforts at 3D modeling the city would consolidate and stimulate the position of Rotterdam as front-runner city and as interesting living lab. So Rotterdam is a living lab as well, just so you know. And part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that one of his partners in crafting Rotterdam Digital City, whatever it is or will turn out to be, is a company called Future Insight. Now, I think the lust for experimentation is very much related to the fact that it concerns computerized technologies. In the history of the computer, experimentation, demoing and testing versioning have been a constant factor. Think of the role of demos in interactive computing, starting most famously with the mother of all demos in 1968, in which Douglas Engelbart illustrated interactive computing by introducing a prototype of the computer mouse. He's actually, and his team is actually have been the people who called a mouse, and then later regretted it, but now we all do it. And they also introduced, as you see here, word processing and also video conferencing. So this mother of all demos. And one reason computing goes hand in hand with this fascination for experimenting lies in the nature of computing. Computing involves a history of the version in which the future is yet another version. Both new software and new hardware have enabled a confidence that there is no natural endpoint to computing. So efficiency will increase in the future and optimization will continue. Futurity in computing is therefore a repetition of the past within ever-changing parameters. Hence the meaningless expansion of things like 2.0 to various other domains. And another reason computing and experimentation often go together is that many of its roots lie in cybernetics, where processes of optimization are central. Cybernetic processes are considered as self-organizing processes that tend toward certain system states without necessarily ever reaching them and without a set end goal. So central to cybernetic processes is the idea of feedback, which some of you may also use as a concept today. Feedback doesn't stop. It continues potentially forever. So in a cybernetic process, the future is a time of new cycles of input and output, of new trials, of new model runs, etc. And new system states are sensed by the system, sensor data are processed and modeled, and the system adjusts towards calculated optimums, after which the cycle begins anew. So indeed, optimization is very much a key element in smart imaginaries. Smart cities are usually considered as cities in which a variety of processes can be optimized through sensing, monitoring, and computing for greater efficiency. Smart charisma and cybernetics historically came together in Project CyberSyn, which was developed in the 1970s by the British cybernetician Stafford Beer, in order to optimize the economy of Chile and ultimately also its political decision-making. You see here the ops room, which was actually never used, partly because Allende was ousted at the time. So in a sense it was a prototype, and it was one of the prototypes for current smart city operations rooms, such as most famously the current one in Rio de Janeiro. Now, if one part of the current smart city vogue for experimenting and living labs has to do with the nature of computing, another has to do with the flexibility and the creativity so valued in the neoliberal governing of life. Here is a quote from an influential definition of smart cities that's been often repeated, and it captures, I think, several elements that exemplify the deployment of smartness in the furtherance of a neoliberal agenda. There is smartness for growth. Smart cities are faster cities, and here you really see a logistical logic that is visible, and I'll come back to that briefly later on. Smartness is related to flexibility in a future of risk, and under neoliberal conditions, risk is really an existential condition. And smartness unites government, business, and citizens in an overall entrepreneurial frame of experimenting with innovation in the face of risk. Now, of course, there is also a crucial relation between finance and technology, and here you see a very limited selection of tech companies and investment capital funds. And in both, there is an important role of speculation and of the future. Smart technology and finance both thrive on the commodification of futurity. So theirs is really a speculative epistemology, and this epistemology is the driver of future capital. Also, very neoliberal tools are used in smart cities discourse, such as rankings, which turn basically every city into a smart city, if mostly failing to be smart enough, as with any hierarchical ranking. And it also introduces a race to stay high in the ranking. And this is one way in which I think interurban competition now plays out, which is itself typical of the entrepreneurial city in advanced capitalism. Now, typical of neoliberal conceptions of competition, as you might say the continuation of warfare by other means, is a focus on disruptive technologies. And this concept, which is in a sense a reworking of Schumpeter's creative destruction, was coined in the context of technological innovation, and it's part of the self-description of, for instance, MIT's Media Lab, which you see here. The Media Lab describes itself as saying it creates disruptive technologies that happen at the edges, pioneering such areas as wearable computing, tangible interfaces, and effective computing. The lab is committed to asking the questions not yet asked, questions whose answers could radically improve the way people live, learn, express themselves, work, and play. And then comes the interesting part. The lab is supported by more than 80 members, including some of the world's leading corporations. These members provide the majority of the lab's more than 60 million annual operating budget. The point I'm making here is simply that the imagination of futurity is closely bound up with corporate interests and more generally with a neoliberal project in which modularization, flexibility, speculation, and depoliticization are highly valued. So future capital is both futurity as a form of capital, and this is literally a key to capital in the future. And smart technologies are ideal ways of maintaining circulations, of producing flexible spaces and flexible subjects. That is why the zone, the exception from regular government, and the lust for laboratories and experimentation go hand in hand. Now, the imagination of futurity is widely present in atmospheres of smart charisma. And not only there, as you see here, which is from Erasmus University's business school. I'm interested mostly in the lower left corner, where it says, this RSM is the business school that thinks and lives in the future, which is so funny. Of course, in this case, it means that Erasmus University has no business school. Or at the very least, one can wonder whether in the present, thinking actually occurs at the business school, which is a good question indeed. But they, of course, have their own marketing department, which pushes the future message consistently. Also in big marketing posters that are everywhere in the building where I happen to work. So I have to say that this brief digression into futurity as stupidity, in all honesty, has some background in a slight frustration over the ideological cluster bombardment I receive when I enter the building where I work. You know, this also seems particularly appropriate if you're studying at a business school that will come to exist in the future. But okay, it's not all capitalist, imperialist bullshit. No, wait, it is. Okay, back to the future of the city. Here is a typical way of selling smartness as futurity. It involves advertising smart city technologies with the message that in the future, much money will be spent on smart city technologies. So there's something self-referential to futurity, which is not strange since the future does not exist. Likewise, here the Crystal Future Life video by Siemens portrays a future city which differs from the current city in its efficient flows, its data hubs, its city cockpit, and its citizen app, and of course its very own Buckminster Fuller style geodesic domes. And it would be futuristic if it didn't have the dome. So traffic flow, that is a logistical concern, is really central to this type of imagination. And this becomes extremely interesting when, like the business school, we have actually existing geographies that are dubbed lands of the future. Maasvlakte 2 here, close to us, is called Futureland, with a website accordingly named. And there's a Futureland express bus that you can take to explore this land of the future. And there's a Futureland ferry also. But you can also do a virtual tour through Futureland. Now, as in the previous image, what's very visible is the connection between smartness and logistical concerns. Smartness leads to efficiency of a variety of flows. It is therefore closely connected to various circulations. And in many cases, I think smartness provides charisma to the implementation of what is really a logistical logic, not only in actual supply chains, but also, because these chains extend into them, to cities. This, too, is a typical logistical image of the city, such abstractions that focus on the logistical circulations, really. It's from an IBM brochure on smart city solutions. And in it, the city appears as a stylized collection of buildings and roads, really a milieu of circulation characterized by smoothness and by seamlessness. And I want to note that the language of a key to the city, it says on the bottom, I don't know if everybody can read it, but it says, the key to the city isn't a key, it's data. I think that language is really quite different from that of, for instance, a right to the city. The former assumes that the city is locked, literally, or rather metaphorically, and that one would need to find access to the processes that make it accessible for manipulation. And the vocabulary of a right to the city assumes its openness to change by starting from a political conception of publics and their struggles over the city. But with all the frenzy about data, we tend to forget that data are never simply data. First of all, they are what the geographer Bob Kitchen has called capta, meaning they are actively captured, not simply found as givens, which data seems to imply. The second, data are only data in a certain use. IBM might just as well have said that the key to the city is calculation. And I now want to turn to this element of calculation in the final part of my talk. This calculation in which the future is performed in highly specific ways. Smart city technologies tend to work with statistics, and specifically with stochastic processes involving calculations of probability. Many smart city technologies are not at all that complicated or fancy in the statistical work they do. If they count, it's a lot, really. But some are. And I want to look at some of the features of a particular kind of statistical tools because I believe they best exemplify a logic of performing futurity that is present also in many other often less complex technologies. And specifically, I want to zoom in on what are known in mathematics as Markov chains. So I won't be giving a mathematical talk now, I'll be able to do that, but I want to say a few things about that, which you all will be able to understand, no doubt. So Markov chains are maybe part of Markov models, which are often used in a variety of epidemiological models and in smart city technologies. They're used, for instance, in traffic optimization models. They're often also used in combination with Monte Carlo simulations, which involve iterative simulations of a model within various parameters, with a Markov chain representing the optimal or ideal development of a given system. And I realize you still have no idea what I'm talking about, so I'll introduce this using Wikipedia now. And if you don't follow Wikipedia, well then, actually I often don't follow Wikipedia. Try looking into quantum mechanics in Wikipedia. There's no way. But, okay, for an understanding of what these Markov chains do with time, and specifically also with time in a political sense of history and of alternative futures, it suffices to zoom in on a few characteristics of them. So here's the definition from Wikipedia. A Markov model is a stochastic model, so let's say a statistical model based on the idea of randomness, describing a sequence of possible events in which the probability of each event depends only on the state attained in the previous event. In other words, a Markov model is a statistical model in which future states are calculated using only present states as input. And yet again, in other words, Markov models assume that the future exists completely independent of the past, given the present. So given the present, the future is independent of the past. So Markov models and the Markov chains of time series with all kinds of state transitions that they consist of start from a very fundamental metaphysical assumption about the future, which is that if you know the present, the future can be calculated from it in various probabilities without further reference to the past. So the past is, so to say, all balled up in the present state of a system. The past is completely encoded in and accounted for in the present. That's the assumption. And this is an image again taken from Wikipedia of a typical Markov chain with two states, with coefficients given for the transition probabilities between those states. So that is the probability of specific transformations of one state to the next. The probability that state A follows state A, for instance, in this model is 60%. And you can apply this to the weather, for instance. So if today it rained and A stands for rain, the probability that it will rain at some point tomorrow is 60%. The probability that the sun will shine, say E, is 40%, right? So, but if E is the present state, then the probability of A occurring would be estimated at 70%. This is a simple Markov chain. And it captures the core idea, because in essence, Markov chains are about the transition of one state to another. There may be more variables involved in what can be called a Markov model, but there's only one transition that counts, from one system state to the next. All previous history is considered irrelevant, and one could say it is assumed to be completely absorbed in each current state. And that is why Markov chains are characterized by what is called the Markov property, which is the assumption that the future is independent of the past given the present, which is also called the property of memorylessness. And I think that's to some extent a bit inaccurate, because I think forgetting is the primary function of memory, which we know from cybernetics. I mean, most of the things you learn you have to forget in order to remember some. So mostly what your memory does is really forgetting, not remembering. But the point is that the past is, for all practical purposes, considered irrelevant in calculations based on Markov chains. And in order to fully grasp that, it helps to consider Markov's own analysis of Pushkin's novel in verse, Eugene Onegin. What Markov did was to take the first 20,000 letters of Pushkin's text and devise a model with which to predict transitions from one letter to the next, taking only vowels and consonants as units of analysis. So he could thus calculate the probability of there being either a vowel or a consonant following a particular letter. And this example nicely shows how Markov chains, which is the technique that he developed in this analysis, pertain to but a very thin slice of what constitutes the world. They concern, in this case, purely the level of syntaxis. They do not deal with meter or rhyme, but perhaps a clever statistician might be able to. But what's more important is that they do not have anything to say about semantics and about pragmatics. So neither the meaning of Pushkin's verse, nor what it does to or with a reader, lies within the scope of Markov's analysis. Nor did he intend to, because these models, that was not his aim. Now, today, these models are used to model natural language, but they do so still on a purely syntactic level. Now, what takes the place of semantics and pragmatics, of meaning and of politics, when these Markov chains are exported to smart technologies that deal with the government of cities? And Markov chains are ubiquitous today. They're used in weather models and gene sequencing models, in financial algorithms, and in smart city applications. Google searches of the web, for instance, are possible only on the basis of Markov chains of hyperlinks. So they're generally deemed very applicable in all kinds of applications. And the Markov property, simply put, again, the idea that given the present, the future is independent of the past, has particular political salience in smart city technologies, when various political questions are depoliticized by outsourcing them to the algorithms of smart city technologies. When traffic flow, for instance, becomes a stochastic time series with the Markov property, the future of traffic flow is nothing but a statistical optimization of current traffic flow. No decisions made in the past and no alternatives deliberated in the present intervene in this. So, for instance, certain roads may have been considered once important to be low in traffic for various reasons of local politics. The entire network of roads is the outcome of sometimes explicit political struggle, as most famously expressed in the struggle between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in New York. And most importantly, perhaps, what disappears in the smart optimization of traffic flow is a particular type of question. For instance, do we want this much traffic at all? Even though it can be routed through the city in a supposedly optimally efficient way, do not ecological and other public concerns require us to wholly step outside the logic of the present logistical circulation? The idea that politically the past may remain relevant and may suddenly resurface, that past events jump across timescales and may not be traceable in every and any present state, or the idea that effects may actually change our perception and political valuation of causes, is really incompatible with the use of Markov chains, of this type of statistics. And this is why it's problematic to take such a statistical tool and introduce it in the context of public issues. As with Pushkin's semantics and pragmatics, a shift is made to an ontological reason where wholly different rules apply. And when it works, it can only work because it intentionally disregards all that we may find important in another sense, be it the semantics of a literary narrative or the pragmatics of public questions. So the Markov property, translated in political terms, comes down to, on the one hand, the complete separation of history from the present and future, and on the other hand, the reduction of the future to an extended present of optimization. So, despite the futuristic imagination of smart city technologies, such technologies actually entail the complete annihilation of the future. Futurity figures merely as part of the charm of smart charisma. It sells solutions because it departs with the idea of radical alternatives, and it reduces politics to problem management, to optimization, foregoing the hard choices and dilemmas that are actually part of politics. And this is typical, I think, of smart technologies. Smart dustbins move us beyond the question how much waste we should actually want to produce. And driverless cars, all the vogue now, make it easy to forget that good public transport is what we really need. Such political questions tend to be neglected when smart technologies are implemented. And this depoliticization is affected by a way of constituting temporality. The future is a future of ever more optimization on the basis of ever new data, with a constant forgetting of history, which is actually the Markov property in statistical analyses of smart cities. And so the future becomes really an eternal return of the present, precisely what Walter Benjamin considered an integral part of the mythical conception of history. Futurity thus entails presence of implementing optimizations accrued in the past, but the past exists only as an extended present. Futurity is really a tautology. Data merely imply the need for more data, and experiments entail the need for more experimentation. And so the future is an iteration of the past as continuous extension or repetition. That is why the city is a mere living lab. And this enables speculation to be continuously repeated as well. New experiments mean new tech startups and new investment capital based on new scenarios and new promises of the same optimization and future efficiency. And just as speculation in financial, in the world of finance leads to capital without labor, so does optimization lead to smartness without political action. And one further political consequence of the city as living lab is that, like in software development, there is a limitation of liability and responsibility in case of crashes, bugs, failures, and so on. Nobody wants to sue Microsoft or hold it accountable when Word doesn't work. So the city as living lab also sits uneasily with what is conventionally called accountability. Now I want to end with two comments. One is on modernity and the other on history. First, by now we should conclude that reference to the future city, the enactment of urban futurity, is a way of memorializing and of activating memory, the memory of modernity, of garden cities, of broadacre city, of the futurist city, the industrial city, and so on, of great experiments in urban futurity. But since we already live in modernity's future, it seems that this is a memory of eternal return. But this can only be rendered credible by donning futurity with a smart charisma and a talk of innovation and disruption that masks the fact that, as Walter Benjamin said, it is precisely the return of the new that never ends. We thus end up simulating modernity by repeating the radical experimentation with the future within the banality of algorithms designed to be utterly incapable of actually opening up to true alternatives. Futurity appears first as tragedy and then as farce. And second, my second and last comment, I think it is important that, given Benjamin's conception of mythical history, we make a distinction between memory and history. Memory entails, as I said, forgetting, but history entails the political remembrance of past forgetting and remembrance. Smart charisma, both when it comes as Silicon Valley ideology and when it comes implemented in Markov models, regulating the streets we actually live on, is radically anti-historical. And that also means that its futures are not really futures at all. Walter Benjamin said in 1934, in Der Autor als Produzent, he said, what we must demand from the photographer is the ability to put such a caption beneath his pictures as will rescue it from the ravages of modishness and confer upon it a revolutionary use value. And so it is, I believe, with contemporary media and smart technologies. The revolution of the future will first need to have a concern for the past as history and care for it in the present as politics. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Misschien kunnen we even kijken voor de laptop aan te sluiten. En dan neem ik al twee vragen op. I think we have time for one or two questions, should there be any. In the back, yes.
Hi. I have a question for the social media. How do you see the future of social media?
Any further?
Yeah, take a second question. I'll have to think
we'll
about this.
answer both at the same time. The mic is yes. Second question.
Yeah, I had a question about the last comment about the return to the past as politics and the smart charisma you're talking about, when actually some of the long-term movements and goals of the Californian ideology seems very similar to colonialism and other sorts of past movements. So I wonder if you could just pick up on that a bit.
Okay. Yeah, those are the questions. There's another one, but
One last one.
okay.
I was wondering if the future cities are like a tragedy and a farce, like you said. How would you see a working class city like Rotterdam changing in a political movement that doesn't comply with most of its citizens?
Yeah. Okay. First, the future of social media. Obviously, I'm not going to say anything about the future of social media. I think what I wanted to say was that what was an exploration of the continuous repetition of certain futures, of certain future scenarios regarding technology. And I wanted to ask really, what are the kinds of knowledge claims and the kinds of forms of power that those questions are related to? So my interest is much more in analyzing what happens when these kinds of questions are continuously asked, rather than trying to look into the crystal ball myself and say something about what kinds of realities will come to appear. And also, by the way, because I have absolutely no clue of social media, I do not engage in any social media, unless, of course, we want to talk about the meaning of the concepts of social and media and what could be said there, but conventionally, social media, I do not do any of them. So I'm really the worst person to ask if you actually want to know anything about the future of social media. But of course, there is no way to ever actually get to know anything about the future because it doesn't exist. And the question about the colonial connection, I think that's very pertinent. Much of Silicon Valley ideology really has to do with a frontier spirit. And this, the lecture I quoted from, this Balaji Srinivasan's lecture, literally uses the notion of the frontier spirit. And it's important to remember that the analogy with colonialism exists on a variety of levels. So financial speculation in the colonial era was speculation with regard to the profits from the colonies, and was very closely tied to the imagination of those countries beyond the frontier, which is very similar to what happens today in terms of technology. And we should also remember that colonization often entailed a very strong sense of experimentation. So much of the colonies were actually sites of experimentation with forms of government and governing populations that were then imported into Western countries. So in that sense, I think much more could be said and should be said about this connection. But it's very pertinent to look into indeed. And then the question about Rotterdam. Actually, could the question be repeated once more?
Since you said that the future is a tragedy of course.
Yeah, well,
How does the political movement in Rotterdam move towards that future? What does it imply?
yeah, okay. Well, I said that I meant to say that the utopian futurity of modernism, which ended up in what you might call a tragedy, is repeated now, but in the version of a farce. But on the future of Rotterdam, I think, Rotterdam is constantly doing two things, I think. It's and that something was said about this in the introduction by Yuri. Rotterdam is constantly holding its past hostage in order to get certain things done in the future. So the idea that Rotterdam as a city has no heart, which is by now complete and utter bullshit, is constantly repeated as a kind of blackmail in order to get certain things done. So if Rotterdam wants to gentrify certain neighborhoods or to demolish neighborhoods where labor class people live, it simply can say, well, you know, we have to do this because Rotterdam has no heart, we still have lots of reconstruction to do, and this is a never-ending cycle. So Rotterdam, in a sense, has its own version of the eternal return, and it has to do with this idea that Rotterdam has no heart, which for anyone living in Rotterdam is actually, you know, a strange idea. Why is there no heart? Another thing is what Rotterdam really does is to project certain images of itself into the future, which always have to do with the problematization of the city as it is now. Rotterdam has been so good at communicating itself. It's only in recent years has it changed its tone, at communicating itself that it is in all the wrong lists, that it has a very problematic population. So a couple of years ago, I found this, the most expressive example of this was on the Afrikaanderplein, where there hung a banner saying, the Afrikaanderplein in, I think it was 2020 or something, a great place to live. Which is a way of communicating to people living there now. It's a shitty place, but you know, if you guys all move out, it will be a great place. And this is what Rotterdam actually is constantly pursuing. It's constantly saying, you know, we are left with an industrial population, but we want a post-industrial population. We really want all those sexy tech startup people. We want them to come to the city, but we're stuck with those people who used to work in the harbor, etc. And so the politics of Rotterdam is constantly about problematizing its own population. And that's a very problematic thing to do. I think a more productive way of imagining the future would be to say, well, what is our population and what can we do with that population?
A big hand, please, for Mr. Willem Schinkel.